My name's Greg. I'm 42, and I've been raising my stepdaughter, Lila, since she was 6. Her mom, Rachel, and I met when Lila was just a kindergartner with a mess of curls and a loud, curious voice. I fell for both of them, to be honest. Rachel was this magnetic, driven woman who made everything feel 10 degrees warmer just by being in the room. Lila was quiet at first, cautious around me, testing me with little things. Would I remember to pick her up from ballet? Would I come to her school play even if she only had one line? I always did. Every time. When Rachel and I got married, I made a promise to both of them. I told Lila, directly, kneeling down to her eye level at the wedding reception, "You don't have to call me Dad, but I'll always treat you like my daughter." I meant it then, and I kept meaning it every day after. Through every tantrum, every science fair, every tear-filled sleepover pickup, I was there. And when Rachel got sick for a while, a bad pneumonia that knocked her out for weeks, I was the one helping with homework, making lunches, brushing Lila's hair when she begged me not to tug. I learned to braid, for her. Even when she rolled her eyes and called me Greg, like I was the janitor, I kept showing up. I knew being a step-parent came with emotional minefields, and I tried to walk carefully. But things started shifting when Lila turned 15. It was subtle at first. More sarcasm, a colder tone. Rachel brushed it off as normal teen behavior. "She's testing boundaries," she said. "It's not about you." I tried to believe her. But then came the backhanded remarks at dinner, the way Lila would barely acknowledge me in public. Once, at the mall, I waved at her and her friends from across the food court. Nothing embarrassing, just a quick hand raise, and she turned away like I was invisible. Later that night, she said, "Can you not do that? It's weird when you pretend we're, like, related." That one stung. Still, I let it go. Teens say cruel things, I reminded myself. Hormones, stress, peer pressure. But the cracks deepened. At her junior year parent-teacher conference, Rachel had to work late, so I went alone. The teacher, Mrs. Morales, shook my hand and smiled politely, but said, "Oh, I didn't realize you were Lila's father. I thought her dad lived out of state." When I explained that I was her stepfather and had raised her for over a decade, she looked surprised. "She only ever talks about her real dad," she said quietly, as if realizing she'd said something out loud she shouldn't have. That night I sat in my car for a long time before going home. I wasn't angry, not yet, but I felt hollow. I had been there for everything. Her real dad, Dan, had barely sent cards. He popped in once every few years with a cheap souvenir and an over-the-top smile, like some sitcom character from a rerun. But I was the one paying for braces. I was the one sitting up during her fevers. I was the one clapping at her recitals, even when she danced like a baby giraffe. Still, I said nothing. I told Rachel about the meeting, left out the part about Mrs. Morales' comment. I figured it would just stir the pot. Maybe Lila was just going through a phase, trying to figure out her identity. But then came senior year, and prom, and the fight. It was a Thursday night. Rachel was out of town for a conference, and I'd picked Lila up from school because her car had stalled again. She was quiet during the ride, scrolling on her phone, barely grunting when I asked about her day. Then, out of nowhere, she asked if I could give her a few $100s for a custom prom dress. "Sure," I said cautiously, "but let's talk about it with your mom when she gets back, just to make sure we're not blowing the whole clothing budget." That's when she snapped. "Oh my God, why do you always have to act like you're in charge?" she snapped. "You're not my dad. You're just my mom's husband. That's all. You don't get to decide anything." I pulled over. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and asked, "Is that how you see me? After everything?" She crossed her arms and looked out the window. "You're not my real family. You never were." The car was dead silent for the rest of the ride. She didn't apologize later. In fact, she acted like nothing had happened. That weekend, she even asked again about the money. I said no, calmly, and she rolled her eyes and muttered something about how real dads don't act like accountants. That was the moment I started to pull back. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I stopped initiating. No more check-ins. No more emotional labor. I stopped reminding her about college deadlines, left the FAFSA forms on the kitchen counter untouched, and watched from a distance as she moved through the final months of high school with an air of smug independence. Rachel noticed and asked if something had happened. I told her the truth about the ride home, about what Lila had said. She was upset, but tried to smooth it over like she always did. "She's a teenager," she said softly. She doesn't mean it. But she did. When the college acceptance letter came, her top choice, a prestigious private university she'd been dreaming about for years, Rachel was beaming. Lila walked into the kitchen with the envelope like she was holding a golden ticket, waving it around with a triumphant grin. I sat at the table, coffee in hand, watching her. She plopped it in front of me. "Guess who's going to St. Augustine University?" she said with that smugness in full force. I picked up the envelope, glanced at the seal. Then I handed it back. "Congrats," I said, nodding. "I'm sure your real dad will be thrilled to handle the tuition." The smirk dropped from her face like someone had yanked a rug out from under her. "What?" she said, laughing nervously. "You're kidding, right?" I didn't answer. I stood up, took my coffee, and left the room. That was 3 days ago, and since then, everything's been unraveling. Lila didn't say anything the rest of that day. But the silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was dense, like walking through fog. Rachel noticed it immediately when she got home. I could tell from the way her heels stopped clicking halfway into the kitchen. She looked from me to Lila, who was curled on the couch with her arms crossed and eyes glassy from whatever fake crime show she was pretending to watch. Rachel turned back to me with that familiar question loaded behind her eyes. "What happened now?" I didn't speak first. Lila did. "I got into St. Augustine," she said, voice hollow. "That's amazing." Rachel smiled, stepping forward. "And Greg said he's not paying for it," she added, barely above a whisper. Rachel turned toward me slowly, brows furrowed. "Greg?" I stayed calm, kept my hands on the kitchen island. "She told me I'm not her real dad, that I don't get to make decisions. So I'm respecting that." Lila flinched. Rachel's mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out at first. "Sweetheart," she finally said, shifting toward Lila. "You said that." "It was just a thing," Lila snapped. I was mad. People say stuff when they're mad. I looked at her. Not angry, just tired. "You didn't say it once, Lila. You've been making that point for years. You've corrected teachers, ignored Father's Day, frozen me out of school events. You wanted me out of that role, so I stepped out." Rachel stood there caught between us, hands clasped tightly like she could physically hold the piece together. "We can talk about this," she said quickly. "Greg, we'll figure it out. We'll apply for aid. Maybe defer a year if we have to." "No," I said gently. "Rachel, I love you. But this isn't about paperwork. It's about 15 years of trying to be a father to someone who decided I was disposable the moment she could draw a line between biology and parenthood." Lila stood up fast. "So that's it. You're just going to let me fall? Because I hurt your feelings?" I didn't rise to the bait. "You didn't hurt my feelings, Lila. You burned the bridge and assumed I'd still drive across it." She scoffed. "Well, Dan says he'll help." Dan, her biological dad. The guy who moved to Arizona when she was 8 and reappeared once every couple Christmases with stories about how hard it was to book flights. Dan, who hadn't sent a single dime during her entire childhood unless we chased him through court. I didn't respond to that. I didn't need to. Rachel did. "Oh, Dan says he'll help," she said sharply, spinning to face her daughter. "That man couldn't pay for your birthday cake, Lila, let alone $60,000 a year. You think he's suddenly going to cover tuition just because you started calling him dad again on Instagram?" Lila blinked, thrown off. "He said he'd figure it out." Rachel laughed bitterly. "He also said he'd be there for your 10th birthday. Remember that? You sat on the steps for 4 hours in a dress you hated waiting for a man who didn't call. But sure, he'll figure it out." I'd never heard Rachel snap at Lila like that before. And I think Lila hadn't either. There was no screaming after that. Just silence again. This time sharper. Lila stormed off to her room, and Rachel sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. "Greg," she said quietly, "you've done everything for her. I see it. I always have. But she's too blind to realize it until the floor's gone." "I'm not trying to punish her," I said. "I know," Rachel replied. "But maybe this is what it takes for her to finally learn what a parent is." That night, Rachel knocked on Lila's door. They talked for hours. I didn't listen in. I just sat on the porch, watching the neighbor's dog chase shadows under the streetlight. I didn't feel vindicated, just numb. The next day, I got a text from Dan. It was the first time he'd contacted me directly in years. "Heard you're trying to dump college on me. Not cool, man. She's your responsibility too." I stared at the message for a solid minute, then typed back, "No." She made it clear I never was. He didn't respond, but the fallout was just beginning. By Sunday morning, Lila had called the admissions office to ask about deferring. They told her tuition deposits were due in 2 weeks. She cried in her room for most of the day. When Rachel offered to help co-sign a loan, Lila asked if I'd change my mind. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. I said, I want to see if you can take accountability first. She didn't answer, just turned away. That night, I overheard her on the phone with a friend. He just flipped. Out of nowhere, she said. Like he's some wounded hero. Whatever. It's not like he was ever my real dad. That was the line. That was the last brick she pulled from the wall. The next morning, I called my accountant. I'd set aside a generous fund for college years ago, under my name, with Lila as the beneficiary. I told him to remove her. He paused on the phone. Are you sure? I didn't hesitate. Yes. And as I walked back into the house, I saw Lila at the table, checking the university portal. Her smile returned for a moment, then faded just as fast. Because the screen read, pending financial documentation, not confirmed. She turned toward me slowly, confusion on her face. Did you? I didn't answer. I just sipped my coffee and said, ask your real dad. Lila didn't speak. She just stared at me, like I was suddenly a stranger in her own house. The kind of look people give when the scaffolding of their world starts to crack, and they're too proud to admit the walls are tilting. I held her gaze for a moment longer than she was comfortable with, then walked past her toward the mudroom, grabbing my keys. I didn't need to go anywhere. I just needed space. Behind me, I heard her voice, quiet at first. So that's it. You're really just done. I turned halfway, one hand on the doorknob. I'm done pretending I matter to you, Lila. That's not the same thing. I left the house before she could respond. For the next few days, we barely crossed paths. I worked from the home office upstairs. Rachel kept her distance, and Lila holed herself up in her room, emerging only to grab food or take long, silent showers. The air was thick with the kind of tension that doesn't spark fights. It just wears you down, like humidity on your skin. I'd catch glimpses of her walking through the hall, eyes puffy but shoulders high, like she was still clinging to some moral high ground that was rapidly crumbling beneath her. I'll be honest, part of me hoped she would come around, that she'd knock on my door one evening, sit on the edge of the couch, and say, I didn't mean it. I was angry. I took you for granted. Not for the apology itself, but for the clarity. The moment of truth where the mask slips and the person beneath finally sees the damage they've caused. But that moment never came. Instead, Rachel pulled me aside one night after dinner, her tone soft but edged with urgency. She's planning to move in with Dan. I blinked. What? She thinks he'll let her stay for a year. Said she'll take community college courses there and transfer later. I couldn't even speak at first. It was like someone had replaced my stepdaughter with a different person, a version of her that made decisions purely out of spite and fantasy. She really believes he'll support her? I asked finally. Rachel nodded, folding her arms. He told her he's ready to step up now, that he regrets missing so much and wants a second chance. I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was pathetic. Dan couldn't even maintain eye contact at family events. His longest commitment in the past decade was a pit bull he rehomed after 2 months because it chewed his sneakers. But Lila had made up her mind. 3 days later, she packed a suitcase. Just one. Tossed in clothes, makeup, her laptop, and, ironically, a framed photo of her and me from her 10th birthday. I watched her hesitate as she held it. For a second, I thought she'd set it down. Maybe even stay. Instead, she tucked it into the side pouch and zipped the bag shut. Rachel drove her to the airport. I didn't go. I didn't ask for a goodbye. And she didn't offer one. The house felt quieter after that, but not in the peaceful way I hoped. It was more like something had been surgically removed, and we were just waiting for the scar tissue to form. Rachel didn't blame me. If anything, she blamed herself for always trying to keep the peace instead of holding Lila accountable sooner. She needs to see who Dan really is, she said one night as we sat outside, sipping wine under the string lights she'd convinced me to install last summer. She's going to, I replied. That's the part one hate. And she did. 2 weeks passed before the first crack appeared. It started as a text to Rachel. Mom, is there a way to transfer health insurance remotely? Dan's doesn't cover prescriptions, and I need refills. Then came a call, which Rachel took in the bedroom with the door closed. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. But the silence afterwards said enough. Rachel came out with a pale face and that clenched jaw she always had when trying not to spiral. He forgot to pick her up from class. Twice. A week later, another text. He pawned his PS5 to pay the electric bill. The fridge went out, and there's moldy food. I'm staying in the guest room, and it smells like wet dog. I read it over Rachel's shoulder and bit my tongue. Another week. Another message. I think he's drinking again. He promised he wasn't, but he passed out on the couch with a bottle in his hand. Said I was being dramatic when I confronted him. This one was followed by a voicemail. Rachel played it for me without speaking. It was Lila, her voice trembling. Mom, I don't feel safe here. I don't know what to do. He yelled at me tonight. I told him I might come back home, and he said I was just like you. Then he slammed a door. I locked myself in the room. I don't think I can stay here. There was a long pause. Then, tell Greg I'm sorry. Rachel looked at me as the voicemail ended. I think she means it this time, she whispered. I nodded once, slowly, but I didn't answer. Not yet. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all those years, picking her up from field trips, practicing spelling words, staying up with her when she had the flu. I thought about the ballet recitals I filmed on shaky camcorder, the nights I tucked her in and turned off the hallway light just how she liked it, slightly cracked so it wasn't pitch dark. I thought about the way she used to cling to my arm when we crossed busy streets, and how that faded with time until it was just me reaching out into empty space. And I wondered, when does love become a transaction? When does being a parent turn into a job application with shifting requirements you can never quite meet? I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I came downstairs and found Rachel waiting at the table. She slid her phone toward me. It's her. She wants to come home. I stared at the phone for what felt like an entire minute. It was surreal, really, seeing her name on the screen again, not attached to a sarcastic remark or a cold shoulder, but to a simple plea. Can I come home? Rachel didn't say anything. She just watched me quietly, letting me process it on my own time. In her eyes, I saw hope, but also fear. Fear that I'd say no. Fear that I'd say yes. Fear of what would happen next no matter the answer. I picked up the phone, thumb hovering over the screen, then tapped to open the text. I understand if you both hate me, but I don't know where else to go. For a second, I saw the little girl I used to tuck in at night. The one who cried when she lost her stuffed turtle at summer camp. The one who once left a crayon drawing on my pillow with the words, "Thank you for being my stepdad." She couldn't have been older than 9 when she made it. I still had it tucked into a folder somewhere in my desk, even though the marker had faded and the paper had curled. But that little girl was gone. And in her place was someone who had grown into a teenager, then a young adult, shaped by choices she didn't always understand and words she couldn't take back. I set the phone down. She can come back? I said finally. But not like before. Rachel nodded, slowly. You want to set boundaries. She can sleep here, eat here, be safe here, but she needs to take accountability. I'm not going to pretend the last few years didn't happen. I'm not erasing everything just because she's scared. Rachel exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. That's fair. We texted her back together, told her she could fly home, that she'd have a place to stay, that we were glad she reached out, but we expected a conversation when she got here. No dodging it. No pretending nothing happened. She agreed right away. I'll admit it. Part of me thought she'd flake. That maybe Dan would sober up just long enough to convince her to stay, to sell her one last dream about family reunification and redemption. But 3 days later, Rachel and I stood in the airport arrivals terminal and watched as Lila came down the escalator with a single duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She looked smaller, not physically. If anything, she'd grown a little taller, a little leaner, but emotionally. Like the world had knocked the wind out of her and she hadn't quite learned how to breathe again yet. When she saw us, she froze for a second, unsure whether to wave or run or cry. Then Rachel walked up first and pulled her into a hug. Lila clung to her like she hadn't touched solid ground in weeks. And when they finally separated, she turned to me. She didn't say hi. She didn't force a smile. She just looked at me with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't hug her right away. I nodded. Let's get home. Then we talk. The car ride back was quiet. Not awkward, just solemn. Like all of us were preparing for something important. Lila sat in the back seat like a guest instead of someone returning home. She didn't scroll on her phone, didn't put in earbuds. She just watched the streets pass by like they were scenes from a city she didn't recognize anymore. When we got home, Rachel went to start dinner, leaving me and Lila on the porch. It was late afternoon, golden hour, and the backyard looked peaceful. Birds chirping, wind rustling through the trees. I sat down in one of the chairs. Lila stood by the railing, arms crossed, unsure of where to begin. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said after a long silence. "But I want to say it. I was awful to you. For years." I didn't interrupt. I thought, I don't know, that if I kept some distance, it would make things easier. Less confusing. Dan always made me feel guilty for getting close to you. Like I was betraying him. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Did he say that outright? Not exactly. But he'd joke about it. Call you the substitute. Say stuff like, "Don't let him think he's your real dad." I guess I started to believe it. And when I was old enough to throw it in your face, I did. She looked down at the porch floor. "And then when you pulled back, I told myself you were just proving me right. That you never really cared. But I know that's not true. I just didn't want to admit I pushed you away." She paused, then looked at me. "You were there for everything. And I never said thank you. I acted like it was your job to love me no matter what. But you didn't have to do any of it. You chose to." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "I wasn't perfect. I know I probably overstepped sometimes. Tried too hard to be something you didn't ask for. But I never did any of it for credit, Lila. I did it because I wanted you to feel safe. To know you were wanted." "I know that now," she said quietly. We sat in silence for a while after that. No grand hugs. No background music swells like in a movie. Just the sun setting and the soft creak of the porch swing in the breeze. Eventually, I said, "So what's your plan?" She sighed. "I want to stay here. Start over. I can take community college classes and work part-time. I'm not asking for a handout. Just a place to rebuild." I nodded slowly. "We can do that. But you'll need to hold yourself accountable. That means working, budgeting, helping around the house. And when you're ready, we'll talk about St. Augustine again. But only if you've shown you're serious." She nodded. "I am." That night at dinner, things still felt tentative. She asked for the potatoes like she was borrowing something expensive. Rachel and I kept the conversation light. Music, movies, what had changed around the neighborhood. But there was a softness in the air that hadn't been there before. A shared understanding that we'd been to the edge of something and somehow managed to step back. Over the next few weeks, Lila began to show she meant it. She found a part-time job at a bookstore, started community college that fall, paid for her own books, did laundry without being asked. And more importantly, she changed how she treated me. No more eye rolls. No more fake politeness. She even started calling me Greg again, not with sarcasm, but with familiarity. It wasn't dad, but it wasn't distant either. It felt earned. One evening, after a long shift, she came home with a small paper bag. "Hey," she said, setting it down in front of me. "I got you something." I opened it. Inside was a keychain. Wooden. Hand-carved. It had the words "Thank you for choosing me" engraved in the center. I didn't say anything. I just smiled. 2 years later, Lila reapplied to St. Augustine. This time, she wrote her own application essay. She didn't ask me to edit it. She wanted it to be hers. And when the acceptance came again, she didn't wave the letter around. She walked into the kitchen, placed it on the table, and said, "I'd like to try again, with your help this time, if you're still willing." I picked up the envelope, turned it over in my hands, then looked up at her. "I think we can figure it out," I said. She smiled. No smirk, just real gratitude. And as she walked out of the room, I noticed the keychain I'd added to my car keys. Still there. Still worn. Still worth everything.